We're apologizing for archaeology. Or it's a play on words because apologetics means to defend. So we're not necessarily saying sorry. But the apologetics of archaeology may be a better way to say it. When we go back in history, going back in time, looking at the evidence we have for biblical stories in the ancient literature, surviving artifacts, what would you guys say the role of archaeology would be in our relationship to confirming the authenticity of Bible stories?
It's the time period.
The time period helps us establish timelines, get dates for things. Yeah, that's one of the biggest uses for it, right? What else? What else can we use archaeology for in Bible study?
Tells you what was used at that time period.
Yeah.
As time progresses, so does weapons, so do cooking utensils, so do storage
Right.
of items.
So we're filling in a lot of gaps on things that maybe we don't have a lot of clarity on.
And if travelers come in, what am I thinking of? Babylon's store different than the Assyrians. The Assyrians store different than Jerusalem. So
Right.
then you'll know who came in or who occupied an area, depending on when you dig or take, or if someone traveled from one area and left a coin or
Right.
whatever.
So establishing different trade routes and who was connected with whom. Another effective use for archaeology and Bible study is figuring out the context of what various things mean. So, for instance, isn't it Jesus that says to do good to those who mistreat you, for in doing so you will heap coals of fire upon their head? And growing up, we watched this video that was put out by a Christian organization. It was like a movie, and these kids were being mistreated, and so the kids went to their parents and asked what they should do about being mistreated. And the parents said, well, you need to just be kind to them and heap coals of fire on their head. And they'll be just so uncomfortable about your kindness that it's like it's a way of getting back at them. You can get revenge by heaping coals of fire on their head. Which sounds, good, and it appeals to our desire to see some justice done, maybe our desire for revenge. It appeals to that side of us, but when you look at the archaeology of the day, it fills in some of the gaps there. So when you look at heaping coals of fire on someone's head, back in the day, everyone heated their house with fire, and they would cook on their fire. And when you're burning a fire all the time, what builds up in your stove? You build up coals. So did they have metal boxes to store their coals in while they cleaned the stove out? No. So when you go to clean the stove out, you have to take the coals, set them aside. You would put them in a pot, and that pot would contain all of the coals of fire. Well, hey guys.
Are we supposed to be down here or over there?
That depends what you're looking for. So here we're doing a Sunday school class on apologetics. Over there is the main Sunday school with Pastor Jeff.
We don't know what we're looking for. I think we're supposed to be.
Probably over there.
Sorry.
No, you're good. See you guys. So you would put your coals in a clay pot, and that would keep them hot for you. While you clean out your stove, you get rid of all the soot, you go and throw that away. But if your coals go out, you have to do something to get your fire going again. And it can take a whole lot of work. Or instead of going through all the work of getting a fire started from scratch without any matches or lighters, you could go over to your neighbor's house and knock on their door, and when they come to the door, you say, hey, I've got my pot, will you fill it with some coals? They'll put the coals of fire in the pot, and then you put it on your head and walk back to your house and start your fire. So that is what archaeology tells us. It means to heap coals of fire on your head, is putting the coals in the pot so that you can carry them back and forth to help people start their fire. So it's simply a way of selflessly being kind to someone who is your enemy, someone who has mistreated you. If they're willing to come to you and ask for help, the lesson is give it to them. The lesson is not to find some subversive way to get revenge on them by being kind. That's not what Jesus is teaching. He's just saying, be kind. Give them the coals. Be generous, regardless of how they treated you. So that's where we can have archaeology that fills in our understanding of a biblical passage. And for us especially, we're not necessarily getting into the interpretation, the hermeneutic side of things. Here, we're focusing on the apologetics of it. So that's why I called this lecture Apologizing for Archaeology. When we use our archaeology, we're asking the question, how do we see archaeology agreeing with the Bible? Where does it fill in the gaps on the timeline? And where does it provide a corroborating witness to verify the legitimacy of the biblical truth? So we're coming from a position where we assume that the Bible is true. But a secular professor of history at the University of Cambridge is not necessarily going to be coming at it from the perspective that we are. He's going to be saying, well, the miracles are impossible. The divine revelation is not possible. But let's just view religion as a way of controlling people and interpret everything in the Bible through that lens. And so the secularist is going to be viewing the biblical literature in a different light than a Christian. Now, what's very interesting is if we get into this conversation of proof versus confirmation, we can see that we might not be able to prove the Bible's true because Christians all agree that the Bible's true in the first place. We don't have to prove that it's true. And the secularists all say, well, the Bible can't prove the Bible's true because the Bible's made up. So maybe the Bible has some things that help us understand history, but it's not a reliable document that contains truth. So from both perspectives, nobody says that you can prove anything from the Bible, but you can confirm things between archaeology and the Bible. So the secular scholars are going to say that we can, most secular and Christian scholars agree archaeology cannot prove the Bible, but most secular and Christian scholars also agree archaeology can confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible and the authenticity of its stories. So, for our purposes going forward, secular and Christian scholars differ over why archaeology cannot prove the Bible. Secularists presuppose that the Bible was edited to include the impossible supernatural elements and place special status on the Jewish people as being chosen by God. On the other hand, for Christians, we presuppose that the truth of the Bible is inherent in itself, and we look to God's word as the final authority, which is not subject to changing tides of historical and archaeological research. So this is a longer quote that I would like to read. I got it from Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. He's a pretty well-known apologist from years past. He quotes and says, Millard Burrows of Yale recognized the value of archaeology in confirming the authenticity of the scriptures. This guy, Millard Burrows, says, the Bible is supported by archaeological evidence again and again. On the whole, there can be no question that the result of excavation have increased the respect of scholars for the Bible as a collection of historical documents. The confirmation is both general and specific. The fact that the record can be so often explained or illustrated by archaeological data shows that it fits into the framework of history as only a genuine product of ancient life could do. In addition to this general authentication, we find the record verified repeatedly at specific points. We have names of places, persons. These things turn up at the right places and in the right periods. So this is what archaeology can do. It can confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible and the authenticity of its stories. It can illustrate and explain various passages and ideas, and then it can illuminate details not mentioned in the text. But for our purposes, we're most interested in that first thing that archaeology can do. It can confirm the biblical accuracy and authenticity of its stories. So jumping into it, let's go ahead and look at some artifacts. So here you'll see 3 different artifacts pictured. I can pull up my handy dandy laser pointer, I think. Yeah, here we go. So let's start over here with verification of Old Testament characters and their historicity. And first, let's look at David. This artifact up here is called the Tel Dan Stele. This mentions very specifically right in here, it says the Bet David, or the house of David. This is our earliest, and really we would call it the first extra biblical reference to David as a historical figure. The Tel Dan Stele, can I get away from my laser pointer? There we go. The Tel Dan Stele represents groundbreaking archaeological discovery that provides critical extra-biblical evidence for the historical existence of the Davidic dynasty. So for a while, there were secular scholars who were saying, well, we don't know that David was actually a historical character. He's more of a legend. He's maybe somebody like, who's the
Samson.
woodcutter guy who has the big ox?
Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan. He's like a Paul Bunyan figure in historic Israeli lore. But when it comes to this discovery, this went to verify that actually the secularists were wrong, and the people who relied on the Bible as authoritative and authentic actually were proved right. So this artifact was discovered between 1993 and 1994, which makes it a fairly recent discovery in the world of archaeology. And archaeology itself is a fairly young science. But a lot of archaeology has been going on since the 1800s. So something happening in 1990, in that decade, it's pretty recent.
Where was that found at?
It was located in Tel Dan, which is up, Dan is the northernmost tribe. And so the region up there, there must have been a tell. Do you guys know what the word tell means? I'm getting ahead of myself. So a tell is a mound of dirt that contains a series of cities built on top of each other. So in the ancient world, they didn't have dump trucks to carry debris to and from a build site. So when you built a structure, you would just build it and put it there, and then you would bury all of your construction debris, and you put it in a pit in the backyard and then cover it over with dirt. Well, the next group of people that came along, instead of trying to move all of the rubble, all of your waste materials and get rid of everything, they would just smash the structure, lay it flat, and then cover it with dirt and build something on top of it. Well, you do this over and over again, and you get these different layers of they call it strata, of different time periods where maybe for 100 years people lived in this house, but then they destroyed that house and built another house on top of it. And then they built another house on top of that, and built another one on top of that. And so in some archaeological digs, you can have, one of the deepest I've seen has 22 different strata, and each represents something anywhere from 30 to 100 years. So pretty decent spans of time between each strata. But if you think about it, if you're looking at a strata in a build layer, it might all be rubble, but if there's going to be things like trash, there's going to be household items, there's going to be architecture that has been destroyed and buried in that strata, if you go back later and look at that, you can determine the way people lived then, what their pottery looked like, what they used different tools for, the different architecture that was popular in that time period. And that's what you can do with a single house. On a larger scale, when an entire city does this over and over again, you get basically the history of the city in these different layers. The way they used to do archaeology is they would bring in a bulldozer and just scrape all those layers away down to the layer that they wanted, and then they would study one layer. But they realized, well, we just destroyed 800 years of history that we can never go back and study again. So they quit allowing people to use bulldozers to scrape off the less interesting parts of a tell. And now anyone who's going to do an archaeological dig, they have to start on the very top and start digging their way down through all of the layers and organizing what they find by those layers and then recording it in detailed books.
So we can learn about each section.
So we can learn about each section of history as it comes down through. So this is why we know where this stone comes from, because it was in the correct layer of strata in one of these tells. So a big city that as people have built on top of the city over and over again, it's turned into a big mound of dirt, and then you can start digging down through those layers and getting the history of the city.
So when they found that was in the right layer area to be biblically when David was.
So this would have been probably 200 years after David, 100 to 200 years later. But the way that the Israeli people talked about someone's household, their family, they would call it the house of David.
So even though it wasn't like written when he was alive, even though they were mentioning him, that gives credit
Right.
to.
There had to have been an ancestor to start the house of
Yeah,
David.
gotcha. Okay,
Yeah.
so just so it gives credence to that. Okay.
And typically, most households would give credence back to their greatest ancestor. So you'll notice when you're reading the biblical story, when people are telling Saul what house David is from, they say, well, he's from the house of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Well, that tells Saul where he's from, but then the greatest person in his household is just his dad. His dad's the most well-known person. None of his grandfathers are well-known. There's no like lore in the society about the house of Jesse. So it's just Jesse has a kid, and so David is from the house of Jesse. David creates such a large dynasty in the Israeli history that all of his descendants after him come to be known by his name. So they're not known as that the son of Zerubbabel or the son of Jehoiakim or the son of Hezekiah. Instead, they all go by the name of their greatest father, which the greatest father over the entire house is David. So all the way down to the time of Jesus, people would claim that they were of the house of David. That's what gives Jesus' claim to that name, the Son of David, who's going to sit on the throne of David forever. Well, because he is the offspring from David, and he was from David's house. So the fact that there is such an early artifact, which I believe this dates to like the 8th century BC, which would be like the 700s. David would have lived in the 10th century. So we're talking within 100 to 200 years after David. Someone writes this and records that they had interaction with the house of David. And actually this stone, I believe, is from a, let me see if I can, let's see it in my notes here. So this is written in the Aramaic language in the 9th to the 8th century BC. Most significantly, this inscription supports the biblical narrative by confirming that the kingdom of Judah was indeed ruled by the Davidic dynasty. With little extra biblical evidence from the monarchic period, the period of the monarchs, the Tel Dan stele provides a crucial artifact for verifying early Israeli history. While the discovery doesn't reveal extensive details about the Davidic kingdom, it stands as a remarkable archaeological confirmation of biblical historical claims. It dramatically mentions the house of David and includes a striking claim by the narrator king of having killed kings, including one from the house of David. So somebody was writing in Aramaic and recording all the different kings that they had killed, and one of the kings that they killed was from the house of David.
So would have been not David because he passed.
David would have been gone for
Right.
200 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So would that allude to Jesus?
No, this is this is too early for that. This is probably, well, I don't know for sure. I haven't looked up what king this most likely would be. So I don't want to speak on something
Okay.
I don't
was just
know.
curious.
Yeah, but this is probably 700 years before Jesus,
Okay.
but 200 years after David.
Okay.
So it's kind of in the middle,
Okay.
and it's one of the monarchs. The monarchs ruled in Israel basically from, just for very general numbers, you could probably say from about 1000 BC up to around 500 BC. So there's about a 500-year period where the monarchs are ruling in Israel.
I read a good thing this morning on, I can't pronounce the guy's name, but on Jonathan's son and David.
Oh yeah, Mephibosheth.
Yeah, on him, and there was two of them in the Bible.
Yeah.
It's mentioned,
Yeah,
but it was a good read this morning.
David's faithfulness to Jonathan and the way that he cared for Jonathan's son, even after Saul tried to kill him so many times, and David took over the kingdom, and people were worried that Saul's kids would try and usurp David, and yet David still took care of Jonathan's
Right,
children.
and I mean, I don't know if this said he even tried to do that when David was on the run, that he tried to take the kingdom back, and even after that, he gave half the king, whatever he gave to
Yeah.
his son, he took that and gave it to his servant
Okay.
that was helping him, because he tried to take it from David when he was on the run,
Okay.
when he was something. So he split his kingdom in half and gave it to the servant who didn't lie to David.
Mm-hmm.
And everything. It was pretty cool. I was reading that this morning. I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's what I was reading.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting.
So,
Yep. And David came to be a very beloved and well-known ruler because he did things even when it was not the best for himself. He did things because it was right, and that got him a lot of clout during the time period. A lot of people appreciated David for that.
it was good. It was good.
All right, well, let's go on to the next artifact. Our next artifact is going to be the Siloam Tunnel inscription. So most of you guys probably don't know the Tunnel of Siloam, but this is the inscription. There's not a lot of really great pictures because it's in a dark, cramped tunnel and it's hard to even be able to see it. But the Siloam Tunnel inscription confirms Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. So, are you guys familiar with Hezekiah's tunnel?
Is that the water?
In the water, yeah. So in preparation for the siege of Sennacherib, when he comes to take Jerusalem and conquer it for his empire, well, Sennacherib comes to the city, and they could actually survive for a long time without water because they had water access, and that was done by King Hezekiah. So Hezekiah decided that Jerusalem needed better water access in case of a siege. This guy Sennacherib was going around laying siege to cities and capturing them, and it was a big thing. So what he did is he dug this big tunnel through solid rock all the way to a spring that was nearby. So it was like this secret water source that was able to supply Jerusalem and keep the people watered even in the middle of a siege where all access and trade routes were cut off. So we can see the sieges, things happening in Jerusalem in 2 Kings 20 and 2 Chronicles 32:30. But this is a remarkable archaeological artifact that provides a vivid first-hand account of an extraordinary engineering achievement in ancient Jerusalem. When you look at this inscription, it looks like it was written probably by the foreman of the project who was in charge of the dig. And what they did is they both dug from either end. They did a bunch of math, figured out where they needed to start digging from, and they dug from either side until their tunnels met in the middle. Once they got within 3 feet of each other, the one side quit digging and they just started yelling, and the other side continued digging until they found the people who were yelling, and they were able to join the tunnels in the center. And from those tunnels, they were able to divert the water from the spring and bring water through the tunnel to Jerusalem. So this Siloam tunnel inscription is fascinating because it records the name of the people who worked on the tunnel, the method that they dug the tunnel with, and then when you go back and you date it, the radiocarbon dating for the tunnel actually fits with the time of Hezekiah. So here we have archaeology providing details to the story, so we know more about how they dug the tunnel and what happened there than we get from the biblical account, but it helps fill in some of the details and confirm what we already know to be true. This last inscription, and this is why I had to record the video a different way, because I didn't want my picture in front of this depiction. But this is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser would have had control of the Levant or the land of Canaan where Israel sits. He had control of the region at the time of Jehu. If you remember Jehu, he's the guy who killed Ahab and Jezebel and took the kingdom of Israel from them. And then King Jehu ruled from Samaria. Well, Jehu was a what do they call it? Not a subject of, but he paid tribute to Shalmaneser III. And this depicts either Jehu himself or one of his ambassadors going to Shalmaneser and paying tribute. And on this obelisk, it records what the tribute was, and it includes details of how much gold, how much silver, what other precious things that he gave as a part of his payment, basically a tax, to Shalmaneser III. So this provides a source that is outside the control of Scripture, outside the control of, and actually the Tel Dan Stele and the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. These are sources outside of the Bible, outside of the realm that could even be controlled by any kind of a Jewish person, and it gives verification from these external sources for the biblical stories. So through these different artifacts, we can confirm and verify biblical stories and show that they are historically accurate and verifiable. Moving on, we also have various cities. Archaeology identifies consistency with the Bible, showing that these various cities had walls, as the Bible describes. They have burn layers, as the Bible describes, and they have different historical evidences. So here we're looking at the archaeology for the city of Jericho. On the left, you'll see depicted the original, or not the original, the current way that the city of Jericho looks. You see people have their gardens and vineyards planted around. There's little houses dotted all over the hill. But here in the middle is where ancient Jericho would have sat. It was a town with a lot of stone structures, so it makes it really impossible to try and garden today. And because of government regulations, unless you have a lot of money to do an archaeological dig, you can't actually build anything on top of a tell like this. So this is what the city of Jericho looks like today, but this is an artist's depiction of what it would have looked like back in the time of Joshua. So before the walls fell down, before the siege of the city, these are what the walls would have looked like. Now, when we go and we look at the archaeology of it, you go through the different layers of the tell, you find the era when Joshua would have been conquering Jericho, and you find that the city has been burned just like Joshua said, and that the walls, when they fell down, they toppled outward, which is really unique. I believe it was the archaeologist named Garstang who worked on this dig, and Garstang was astounded because most cities that have crumbled walls, they mostly crumble inward. Someone comes and smashes the wall and smashes it in. But these walls were smashed out. So why would there be this one city that has these walls smashed outward unless God is the one who knocked the walls down and crumbled them so that the people could go up into the city and capture the city? So there's evidence for the biblical miracle of the walls being crumbled. And what's also interesting is for most cities that have a burn layer, Typically, that's during a conquest, and for a walled city to be conquered, that usually took some time. That usually took a big siege, and it would take months or even years for an attacking army to siege a city and capture its people. What's unique about the burn layer from Joshua's time is that they still had food stores intact. So if they were going to have this really long, prolonged siege, the people within Jericho would have eaten all the food storage. They would have eaten all the food. But what we find is that there are still food stores that are intact and still in that layer of the city. So why would that food still be there unless the siege was very short? Maybe something as short as a 7-day siege, like what we see in the book of Joshua. So here we see the city of Jericho providing great validation for the truth of Scripture. We can also look at the ancient city of Megiddo. Megiddo, you can see I put a dot on the map up, or a star on the map up here where Megiddo is located. Over here you see the land of Goshen. This is Egypt. And Egypt, on and off throughout history, controlled various portions of the Sinai Peninsula and up into the Levant, controlling portions of Israel. But during biblical times, the city of Megiddo would have been a main hub for Egyptian control. So the Egyptians would have had their center of control, their center of power in the land of Canaan, located at the city of Megiddo. So when you go back historically, you see that this is first mentioned, the city of Megiddo is mentioned by Thutmose III in his historical records, and he records that he conquered a Canaanite army in 1468 BC. After that, it became an Egyptian stronghold, so Thutmose goes up and he conquers the Canaanites who lived there, and Thutmose takes over and makes it an Egyptian stronghold, and then it maintained its importance for a significant period of time. The city was fortified by Solomon, and later fell to Pharaoh Shishak I in 924 BC, and then later to Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria in 733 BC. So this city, it's being controlled by different people, it's being rebuilt. We know that Solomon controlled it at one point, because when you look at the cities that Solomon built, there's this very common gate construction that he used, where he would build a city gate to be a long hallway, and then in that hallway he would have 6 rooms, a series of 6 rooms off to either side of the wall. So it made it very easy for a defender to protect the city, while at the same time, if you're trying to be the attacker and go in through, well, all the people defending the city gates have these little cubbies where they can hide out and fight the people who are coming in. And then during times of peace, they can be used for things like storage, or the government officials, the bureaucrats can have offices back there, stuff like that for import tax. It was a very functional design, and it's one that is very unique to King Solomon. Other kings who built cities and built gates did not typically use that design for a gate. And that's why we know the city of Megiddo was controlled by Solomon at some point, because he built a gate with that very unique 6-chambered gate design. We can go on to this city of Hatzor, or Hazor, and that is just north of the Sea of Galilee. I was looking at a map, and if I remember right, it's kind of between where Capernaum and Nazareth would have been during Jesus' lifetime. But it's just north of the Sea of Galilee, and this would have been one of the most populated cities in biblical times. So Jerusalem was the capital, and then you have Samaria, and that was another capital. But then Hatzor would have been maybe the third largest hub of life in Israel. And one of the reasons it was such a hoppin' town was because they had relatively few mountains between them and the Mediterranean Sea. So they had ocean access and access to those ports there, but then they also had the resource of all the water, the Sea of Galilee, these big fertile plains that you see pictured here. But then you see this mound of dirt right in the middle with various digs happening on the top. This is the city of Hatzor. And this would be the Tel for Hatzor. But they don't call it Tel Hatzor. It's actually named based on a more modern city name. And so it's called Tel El Qadah. So here at Tel El Qadah, we have the remains of the city of Hatzor. This is a city that's frequently mentioned in Egyptian records. It notably shows up in Thutmose III and Ramses II, which Ramses II would be a lot closer to like the Davidic dynasty in timing. But when we see the city of Hatzor in the Bible, this is highlighted in Joshua's conquest, where its king was defeated, and it later became a part of Naphtali's territory. So in all those really long, boring chapters where it says, and we traveled to this place and defeated these kings, and then we gave the land to this tribe of Israel, and it reached from this city to this city to this city, and it covered all of those really boring passages, give us a lot of historical record and detail for things like being able to identify where Hatzor was, as well as the what tribe controlled Hatzor. So it would have belonged to Naphtali. It was rebuilt later on by Solomon, and then it was destroyed again 200 years after Solomon by Tiglath-Pileser III when he came and conquered with the Assyrians. So this is a more complex tell because it has a lot more strata. So this is one that's got 22 different layers of strata, and it has it definitely been inhabited probably since the 12th century BC, but we know for sure they have a complex water supply system, as well as temples and a intentional city design in the 10th century BC. So we're talking 3,000 years ago. This city was inhabited, and at various times it was inhabited by Canaanites, and then it was inhabited by Jews, it was inhabited by Egyptians, it was inhabited by Assyrians, and it just shows the complexity of the different armies that had come in and conquered the region. And when you look at the biblical account, it matches with all of these historical data. So the archaeological findings at Hatzor provide insights into its historical significance and its urban development over the centuries. When we look at each of these cities, we see Jericho, we see Megiddo, we see Hatzor. These excavations confirm that these cities fit the biblical account. So when the Bible says that it was a walled city, you go back and look, and lo and behold, there's a walled city. You see the biblical account saying, in the time of Joshua, they burnt this city to the ground. Well, you can go back, and the soot, the black dirt, is still there from the burning of the city. And so you can go and verify, yes, in fact, there was an eyewitness who knew that this city had a wall structure, and then it was burnt to the ground, that wrote the record for the Bible. So we know for sure that there was an eyewitness who wrote the Bible who knew what was happening here in these different cities. Cities like Nazareth, Bethlehem, and Capernaum are correctly located and described in New Testament narratives. So we didn't get into those other cities, but you go and look at what the New Testament says, and it all fits. One of the big accusations for the New Testament is that it was altered or tampered or even forged by people later who lived in places like Italy or places like Corinth or Antioch, who were trying to make up a story to control people. That was their purpose of creating the Christian religion. Well, the problem with those claims is that when you go back and look at the Bible, you can verify both the Old Testament and the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses to the events. How would you know that a sycamore tree would have been growing in, what's the city where Zacchaeus was? Was Zacchaeus in Jericho? It's not in the
I
song.
taught that last week.
So wherever Zacchaeus was, who else but an eyewitness would know that sycamore trees would have been growing there at the time? That kind of proof of an eyewitness just including this small detail verifies the historical accuracy of the Bible. We can also look at something like the Hittite civilization. We've discussed this before. It was once doubted by skeptics. Skeptics say, the Hittites, that's made up by the Bible. There's no proof for Hittite civilization. It's all fake. And it was mostly these German scholars who were putting this story forward. But I think it was around the year 1900, right at the turn of the last century, they discovered that there is a city in Turkey named Hattusa, and in this city, eventually they came to find a massive library, which had all of these Hittite tablets. In the city of Hattusa, which is pictured here, this is called the Lion Gate because it's a gate and it has lions. Very complicated archaeology happening there. At this, the city of Hattusa in modern Turkey, they were able to verify that Hittites existed. The Bible talked about Hittites thousands of years, throughout thousands of years. So back during the time of, I believe, here we go. I do have notes. During the patriarchal era, Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah to bury his wife Sarah, and he bought that from a group of people who were Hittites. Esau, his son, married Hittite women, and that distressed his parents. During the time of the conquest, while the children of Israel were coming into the land and taking it, they were able to conquer a major Canaanite nation, which the Bible calls Hittites. During the kingdom era, the Hittites were still in the land, and Solomon married a Hittite woman and purchased chariots from the Hittites. During David's time, Uriah the Hittite was a loyal soldier in David's army, and David murdered Uriah the Hittite. So over and over again, you have these Hittites showing up, and people who want to say, well, David was fake and the Bible isn't true, they would go and say, one of the reasons the stories of David aren't true is because he talks about murdering this Hittite. But the Hittite Empire is made up. The biblical authors made up Hittites. But lo and behold, in the land of Turkey, there is the capital city of the Hittite Empire, and we know that they had really far-reaching borders during the peak of their empire, and the Hittite people would have been spread out and dispersed throughout the entire empire. So we have historical evidence verifying that the Hittites did in fact exist, and the Bible talked about it before we had any archaeological or historical proof for the Hittites. We already talked about the Tel Dan Stele, but for Old Testament confirmation, here we have a really cool artifact. If I understand, it's about this big, and it's called the Cyrus cylinder. So in the Bible, we have the biblical authors talking about how, Isaiah prophesies that Cyrus would come and send Israel back into the land. And then later we have I believe it's Ezra and Nehemiah who talk about going back into the land. And Ezra specifically records a proclamation from Cyrus that the people of Israel, after their exile, should be sent back into the land of Israel. So here is the Cyrus cylinder, where Cyrus has his record of that proclamation. This confirms that King Cyrus's decree to allow the Jews to return and rebuild the temple in Israel, and it confirms that it's true. The cylinder matches the biblical account, where Cyrus says, "I returned to them their dwellings and let them go to their homes." So here we have a very detailed, specific piece of archaeology verifying the book of Ezra and his record of Israel going back into the land. You guys remember Jesus healing the lame man at the pool of Bethesda? The man who tried to crawl down and touch the water so that he could be healed, but someone else always got to the water first. Well, at the top here, you'll see a artistic depiction of what it would have looked like in Jesus' time. And today, archaeologists have uncovered these arches that is what remains of the Pool of Bethesda. This was excavated in Jerusalem. It has pools surrounding colonnades and 5 porches that are described in John chapter 5. So when John gives a detailed description of what the Pool of Bethesda was like, it matches with what we discovered of it, and we can see it here today. Also, for New Testament confirmation, I've got the Pontius Pilate inscription mentioned. We looked at that last week, and we got to see the stone tablet on the slide, so I'm not going to go back and review that in depth. But essentially, it's a stone inscription that confirms Pilate's historical role as the prefect of Judah. Further New Testament confirmations, we have the Erastus inscription in Corinth. That's not pictured here. That's actually the Gallio inscription. But this stone, it was a dedication for a structure. It reads, Erastus, the city treasurer, laid this pavement at his expense. So then, when you go and you read Romans chapter 16, verse 23, you see Paul directly mentions Erastus. So we have this confirmation of a character in history that is also appearing in the biblical text. We also have the Gallio inscription, which for those of you who are working on your Greek, you guys might recognize the majuscules or the capital letters in Greek. So you see this little upside down L here. That's your gamma, alpha, lambda, iota, omega. And I'm not 100% sure what this letter is. But it says Gallio. Gallio would have been the Roman proconsul in Delphi, Greece. The Roman proconsul's name and his tenure, so the amount of time that he served, is recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 18, verses 12 through 17, and it is confirmed by stone inscription. And this stone dates to the time of the writing of the New Testament, to AD 51 to 52. This provides a fixed date for Paul's Corinthian ministry. So when Paul is in Corinth, he says that he was there during the time that Gallio was proconsul. And here we have a inscription on a building that verifies the accuracy of Paul's account. So what's our apologetic takeaway? There's all these really cool things in archaeology. Archaeology's cool. We like to look at old things. We like to be able to read it when we're using our language skills. That's fun, but how does it actually help us show people the truth of Christianity? First, archaeology consistently confirms both Old Testament and New Testament accounts. It shows us historical figures, kings, cities, decrees, and political titles. Each one of these things shows up at some point in the biblical record and can be verified by external archaeology. I believe for especially the Old Testament, we have over 40 different characters that are mentioned by name in the biblical account, and then you see those same names that are verifiably the same people show up in archaeology. So what we looked at today, we had 10 slides, or actually 9 slides, but actually there's a whole lot more than all of this. There's 40 different characters in the biblical record that can be verified by archaeology. Number 2, evidence such as the Tel Dan stele, the Cyrus cylinder, the Pilate inscription, and the Gallio inscription corroborates the biblical narrative in ways that are independent of Christian tradition. If it was a part of Christian tradition, the Christians could go in and mess with things, right? Maybe the Pope could say, hey, we need to rewrite this verse in the book of Romans for this purpose, or we could forge some ancient artifacts to be able to prove the truth of our religion. Well, these things are outside of Christian or popish control in ways that would have been completely inaccessible until now. So through the verification of these external sources, we see the case for Scripture's historical reliability becoming strengthened over time. So it becomes something that's a whole lot more provable from a historical standpoint. But I said we don't call it proof, but it's confirming a historical perspective of Scripture. So from all of this evidence, like we talked about at the beginning, we have wonderful confirmations for the truth of the Bible. So for someone who says, hey, I want some evidence, I want some proof, can you show me in history somewhere where that actually happened? You can say, well, absolutely I can. So let's go through and look at these things that I have on this handy dandy outline that I'm going to take home. And that provides you with a lot of proof to show your atheist friend.